Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the National Press Club for today's National Australia Bank Address. Before I introduce our guest today, I'd like to acknowledge that we've been joined for the first time at the National Press Club by the new ambassador, the US ambassador to Australia, Mr. John Berry, and his partner. This is the first occasion they've visited the club. We certainly hope it's not the last. Welcome. Today is one of those special days for the Press Club, one in which just a little bit of important history is made. Dr Tom Calma is an Aboriginal elder from the Kungarakan tribe near Darwin. Immediately following today's event, Dr Calma will be officially installed as the 6th Chancellor of the University of Canberra, only the second Indigenous person to hold such a position in this country and the first male Indigenous Australian to do so. A strong advocate for Indigenous rights, Dr Calma has spearheaded a raft of initiatives designed to empower Indigenous communities, particularly the critical areas of health and welfare in the Indigenous area. In 2010, he was appointed the National Coordinator for Tackling Indigenous Smoking to lead the fight against tobacco used by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. Last year, he was named the ACT Australian of the Year for his work in human rights, and today he's here to address the National Press Club. Would you please welcome Dr Tom Calma.
Thank you, Laurie. Your Excellencies, Vice-Chancellor, distinguished guests and friends, both here today and also who may be watching this broadcast across Australia. I acknowledge the traditional owners of this land that we're meeting today, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, and the elders from all the other Aboriginal groups who are here today. I also acknowledge the youth of Australia, who will be our leaders, our future leaders, and the custodians of our cultures, our stories, our histories, and our languages. As I take up this exciting and challenging position as Chancellor of the University of Canberra, I want to talk about success and what is needed to close the inequality gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, and why reconciliation is fundamental. I'll share my vision on how our universities can lead these important changes and how we, as a caring country, must get involved to solve these important challenges. Noting that Professor Sandra Harding, Chair of Universities of Australia, will be speaking next week, I'll bias my talk to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander issues today and our engagement with the higher education sector, as this is an issue that's common to all of our universities. And on the occasion of my formal installation as Chancellor of the University of Canberra, I'll take many of my examples from this institution, the University of Canberra, and I hope you'll permit a very proud Chancellor this indulgence. Let me tell you something about my previous experience in education. As a mature-age student in 1977, just a couple of years after Cyclone Tracy devastated Darwin and virtually eliminated higher education opportunities locally, I moved to Adelaide to take up tertiary studies at the South Australian Institute of Technology. I was in the second cohort of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students to study social work at the newly formed Aboriginal Task Force. The Task Force was an initiative of the Adelaide Aboriginal community that enables students to undertake tertiary studies in a supported environment with peers who had similar but different backgrounds. In the early 1970s, there were only 18 known Indigenous students studying at any university across Australia. My first employment engagement with higher education after leaving university was in 1980. Bolstered by my own post-schooling experience, I established, along with other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues, the Aboriginal Task Force at the Darwin Community College. The Task Force was modelled on its namesake in Adelaide, and it was a second chance opportunity for people who had not made it through the secondary education system, but who had an interest in learning and were very keen to get back and catch up on those opportunities that they'd missed. I left academia after 6 years, including 5 as head of the Aboriginal Task Force, to return to Indigenous employment, education and training policy management in the Commonwealth Public Service in Darwin. I moved to Canberra in 1992, and after a couple of years I secured an overseas diplomatic posting in India as a Counsellor of Education and Training. In 1994-95, 5 counsellors were posted to Asian countries to represent Australia's interests in education and training, to develop education system relationships, support Australian education providers in country, and develop interagency relations to facilitate the development of an international student program. I also facilitated the opening and the oversight of education offices in Pakistan, Nepal and Sri Lanka. In 1998, I was cross-posted to Vietnam to do similar work. In 1999, the representative of an American philanthropist endeavoured to engage my services to advance his group's interests in Vietnam. Because I was a diplomat, I could only work for Australian entities, so Atlantic Philanthropy invested money in Australian universities on the condition that they would engage me to manage their in-country activities. Over the following decade, Atlantic Philanthropies invested tens of millions of dollars in the Australian higher education sector, including support that enabled RMIT University to establish a campus in Ho Chi Minh City, and they now have campuses across Vietnam. I returned to Australia to work in Indigenous education again in 2002, having been away from that specific sector for a decade. From 2004 until I retired from the Australian Public Service in 2010, I worked as the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner and Race Discrimination Commissioner at the Australian Human Rights Commission. It was a difficult period to be in these roles, as it saw greater racial tensions following the London and Bali bombings and the Cronulla riots. It was also a difficult time in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs with the abolition of ATSEC and major breaches to human rights and citizen liberties with the Northern Territory intervention. However, it was also a rewarding period as I was able to lead and participate in a number of major reforms in Indigenous affairs. Most significant were the establishment of the Close the Gap campaign that advocates for health equality by 2030, responding to the government's apology to the stolen generations, steering the formation of the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples, and promoting the concept of justice reinvestment. Although I retired in 2010, I find myself more engaged than ever with a whole range of commitments, and now especially in this position as Chancellor. In 164 years, I'm the second Indigenous Australian to be a Chancellor of one of Australia's 39 universities. Dr Pat O'Shane, Chancellor of University of New England from 1994 to 2003, was the first, and I'm the first Indigenous male to take on such a role. Small steps, yes, but it's encouraging and with pride that I note the untold story. We have, and this is only an estimate, 12 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on university governance bodies, one Deputy Vice-Chancellor, who is Professor Shane Houston at the University of Sydney, 6 Pro-Vice-Chancellors, 6 Deans, 42 Professors and 335 academics. So are we breaking or just scratching the glass ceiling? Are these numbers good enough, or do we need to do more like New Zealand is, where it's very unusual for a university not to have a Maori in a senior position? This is a challenge for all of us, particularly the university sector. The role of education in creating opportunities and equality is well known. Education has been described as an effective way to vaccinating against poverty. Scientific research has demonstrated overwhelmingly that poor people have less financial and other forms of control over their lives. This inhibits university participation. Poor education and literacy are linked to poor health status and affects the capacity of people to lead a long and full life and to access and succeed in school, post-school and higher education. And so it's encouraging that Indigenous participation in our universities at all levels, not just as Chancellors, has grown in a relatively short time since Charlie Perkins graduated in 1965 from the University of Sydney. More than 1,200 Indigenous people completed university degrees in 2012. The growth rate in employment is very strong, with more than 10,000 students. I shouldn't say employment. The growth rate in enrolments is very strong, with more than 10,000 students now enrolled and another 1,100 in enabling courses. In the past 4 decades, over 25,000 Indigenous Australians have completed tertiary education, and by 2020 it's forecast to be around about 50,000. We have 164 doctorate degrees, and 324 of our people are studying a doctorate degree at the moment. In some professions, the journey has been slow, and greater effort needs to be focused by the institutions and by the community to ensure that higher education is an aspiration and an achievable goal. In 1866, the first Indigenous Canadian doctor completed her studies. In 1899, the first Maori doctor graduated from medical school in the United States. But it was not until 1983 that Helen Milroy graduated from the University of Western Australia as Australia's first Aboriginal medical doctor. And Dr Milroy is also our first and only psychiatrist. There are now around 180 Indigenous doctors and 260 medical students in Australia. However, there's approximately 80,000 doctors registered in Australia, so to reach population parity of about 3% in the medical profession, it would require an immediate addition of 2,400 doctors. Now, while our participation rate at medical colleges reaching parity, there is still a lot to do to maintain the number of eligible candidates entering university. So we are talking about participation rates. The same is not the case for other professional disciplines, where greater effort is required by universities and in inspiring our youth to take on tertiary studies across all disciplines. For example, we only have 8 dentists. And I'd like to acknowledge, I think he's here today, our first Aboriginal dentist who graduated in 1982. He's with us today. ACT member of the Legislative Assembly, Dr Chris Burke. You here, Chris? Is he there? Yeah. All right. Oh, he is. Chris, well done. I missed you. So all this is good news, but it's not good enough. There's a lot of government emphasis being placed on schooling, and this is warranted if we are to close the gaps. But governments need to be bold and explore initiatives and proven early childhood programs that address parent engagement, learning development and health issues like otitis media or inner ear infection or middle ear infection. A holistic and inclusive approach like this is being delivered by the Australian Literacy and Numeracy Foundation in Kempsey, Tennant Creek, Palm Island and Groote Eylandt, with overwhelming success in attendance, participation and learning, fundamentals that are critical to education success. But it's important to note that this is not a simple and one singular solution. So how do we get young people, Indigenous young people, or for that matter all young people of any group that has not traditionally aspired to a university education, to be educationally prepared to take on a degree, to apply to a university and to stick it out for 3 or more years? At the University of Canberra, we send young people we call aspiration agents out to low socioeconomic status schools. These students teach high school kids that university is in their grasp and that it will be a supportive environment. Our UC College provides pathways for people who didn't get the results they wanted out of school, but who have the potential and the drive to thrive at university with a bit of help. There are a number of other initiatives directed to increasing retention and or participation at the schooling level, like the Australian Indigenous Mentoring Experience, or AIM you might know it as, boarding school programs and more recently the Truancy program in the Northern Territory. Specifically for Indigenous students, organisations like the Charlie Perkins Trust, Roberta Sykes Trust, the Aurora Project's Aspiration Initiative and the Poach Centres creates excellent pathways to higher education at the postgraduate and undergraduate levels. The Aurora Project works with my university to build the aspirations of young Indigenous high school students across New South Wales, Victoria and West Australia. We try to get them to understand and to be all that they can be, to reach their full potential, to ensure that they finish high school and understand that they have an option to study at university. Aurora, in partnership with the UC, also manages the prominent Charles Perkins or Charlie Perkins and Roberta Sykes scholarships to study at Oxford, Cambridge and Harvard universities. Just over 3.5 years ago, there had never been an Indigenous Australian studying for a full-time degree at either Oxford or Cambridge. During 2003, there were 14 Indigenous postgraduates studying at 2 of the top 10 universities in the world, and 5 of our Indigenous scholars succeeded and successfully graduated in 2013. Now, these Indigenous scholars are a great example and they're a great role model of what's possible for Indigenous Australians with the right opportunities and support. Charlie Perkins scholar Lily Brown became the first Indigenous Australian to study a full-time degree at Cambridge University. She graduated with her Masters in 2013 with distinction, which put her in the top 10 at the top-ranked university of the year that she applied. This is an incredible achievement for somebody who was told at Year 10 that she'd plateaued in her studies and should not continue through to Year 12. Unfortunately, this is still an all too common story of low expectations for Indigenous students, and that's why UC has partnered with Dr Chris Sara's Stronger Smarter Institute to break down barriers to higher education for Indigenous students and those from low socioeconomic backgrounds by raising aspirations and achievement within these groups. But all of this costs money, and this is where you can help. Vice-Chancellors are good at telling governments that they need money, so I'll leave that to them. And anyway, funding universities is not solely the responsibility of governments. I'd like to go straight to the individual. If you're an alumnus, a corporate, a philanthropist, or just keen to invest in human capital and to Australia's future, please consider donating to a university, your university or any of the universities. We hear there's no culture of philanthropy in Australia, but that's not strictly true. Australians gave more than $2 billion in tax-deductible receipts in 2011. Australian universities recorded $284 million in donations and bequests in 2012, which is about 1.1% of their total revenue. However, most of this came from endowments that have been building over decades rather than regular or more recent giving. The University of Canberra is playing its role and playing on its strength in this regard. We have plenty of land and an innovative culture, so we're inviting partners to develop the campus with us. Now, this is not a sell-off, it's an opportunity for genuine partnerships where we work together in research, education and community service. And this includes using our land for some distinctive collaborations in health. From the GP super clinic that has been built on campus, our students will lead a range of allied services in disciplines like physiotherapy and nutrition. They get the hands-on experience they need and the public gets very affordable care. We're also partnering with the ACT government to establish a public teaching hospital on campus. And here I'd like to applaud the vision in this regard, and that's the vision of the ACT government. They could have put their hospital anywhere, but they chose to put it on our university where the synergies in education and research will benefit the wider community and it will benefit the wider economy. And when it comes to Aboriginal and rural health, universities must be more than teachers, interested observers and researchers. We must be active partners. Partners creating research, adding to the latest evidence, the best techniques, cutting-edge treatments, state-of-the-art equipment. Partners who want to listen, learn, adapt, interpret and share. And the Poach Centres for Indigenous Health are examples of the power of universities partnering in achieving real change and genuine contributions to closing the gap in life expectancy. Funded through philanthropists Greg and Kate Poach, Poach Centres leverage the best of the best in the universities. They work collaboratively with communities and governments across the country to seek and develop solutions that address complex problems. Solutions that may involve the provision of specialist services, the creation of education and training pathways, opportunities for students to participate in health service delivery and health promotion, and collaborative research. High-tech teledentistry and portable dental gear, a portable echo machine with remote monitoring, and mobile clinics enable Poach to combine new graduates and trainees with experienced researchers and clinicians to deliver a great service out in the bush. The flexibility and independence of philanthropic funding, combined with the independence of the university context, supported by Commonwealth and state funding and genuine knowledge exchange, enables innovative solutions that are not limited by program boundaries, funding pathways, policy rhetoric, or state and territory borders. And sport is also an important area in health. Universities once again have a role to play in sport at all levels. At the University of Canberra, we've developed a holistic health environment that incorporates sport, not only at the elite level, but for all Australians. Our on-campus sports hub will be the home of the Brumbies Super Rugby League side, but it will also be the home for the Special Olympics, a research and education facility, and the headquarters for our research into physical literacy. Australian children will live longer as a result of this work. We have a coach in residence, former Opals coach Carey Gruff, and we provide flexible teaching and learning programs for elite sports people. Now, while I have the platform to talk about universities, I'll take a moment and talk a little bit about international education. International education brings about $15 billion a year into Australia, making it the single largest service export for Australia. But that's just part of the story. For students we welcome from other countries, the experience is even greater. In a global economy, the relationships Australia builds with the people who come here to study are invaluable. A couple of decades ago, Nguyen Xuan Vang was spending late nights at the University of Canberra Computer Labs writing a thesis for his Master of TESOL. In 1999 in Hanoi, I worked with Vang and colleagues to establish the Vietnam Graduates from Australia Club, a non-aligned alumni association that now boasts over 5,000 members and is one of the most active Australian alumni associations globally. And today Vang is Vietnam's Director General of International Education, responsible for tens of thousands of Australian and Vietnamese students studying in each other's countries. Last year I experienced the awed hush descend upon a room at our Distinguished Alumni Awards when UC graduate Ibrahim Ismail recounted his experiences fighting for education reform and political change in the Maldives. Ibrahim, like the 150 AusAid-sponsored alumni from 30 African countries I addressed in Cape Town last year, are doing amazing things in their home countries on the backs of their Australian university qualification. Now, every university has stories of international graduates who credit their Australian experience with the amazing things that they're able to achieve in their life journey and back into our country. So I'd like to encourage all of our universities and all of our society to recognise the importance of having international students here and showing them the respect that they need. So following on with the theme of respect, understanding and friendship, let me turn to the subjects of reconciliation and recognition. Through the Reconciliation Action Plans, or RAP program, organisations develop business plans that document what they'll do within their sphere of influence to contribute to Reconciliation Australia, to a reconciled Australia. Now, these RAPs outline practical actions the organisations will take to building strong relations and enhanced respect between other Australians and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Put simply, the RAP program is about working with organisations across Australia to turn their good intentions into real action. 10 of our universities, including UC, have a Reconciliation Action Plan and 8 are developing RAPs. And I'd urge other universities to consider the same. They are so important for the university community. This year our nation will begin to focus even more intently on a historic opportunity. And I speak of the chance to end our constitutional silence about the fact that somebody was here on this land when Europeans arrived in 1788 and for tens of thousands of years prior to that day. And I speak of the chance to remove the traces of racial discrimination that diminish our highest document of law, like the section that still says the states could disqualify anybody of any race of people from voting. Now, I want to take some time in this address to outline in greater detail why we need to come together as Australians to fix this at a referendum and why we should all feel invested in this. I want to convey why this is an exciting and uplifting opportunity for every single Australian. And finally, I want to entreat you into action, because as this conversation intensifies, every single one of us who has a platform of some kind, from the very first Australians to the very newest Australian citizens, should feel responsible. They should feel a responsibility and a duty to bring our leadership and the voices to the historic quest. Get actively involved in the recognition or the recognised movement. So why is constitutional recognition of the first Australians so crucial, and why should it matter to every Australian? For me, this is clear and compelling. It's about the fundamental rightness of acknowledging the simple truth that this land was first inhabited by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. It's about Australia acknowledging the deep and ancient origins of our country, and about all of us being connected through the first Australians to one of the most impressive and inspiring spans of human history on this planet. And it's about us helping to safeguard Australia's unique national identity for future generations so that we can sustain our country's first cultures through an even greater sense of shared pride in them. The goal of constitutional recognition for the first Australians is not a new aspiration. For decades, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been urging our nation towards this moment of respect, acknowledgement and unity. For many of us, this is fundamental to making our nation whole. And to many, it's an essential part of helping to heal the wounds and exclusion of 2 centuries and forging a more united future together. The great leader of the Gumatj people of Arnhem Land, Dr Yunupingu, put it this way: I wanted constitutional recognition to bring my people in from the cold, to bring us into the nation. And when we put this right, we'll all be at a point of history where the 2 great tributaries of our heritage flow towards and flow into one mighty river. Because the choice to keep intact the constitutional silence about our tens of thousands of years of history on this land should discount, diminish and dismiss our contribution to the making of Australia. Conversely, the choices that we make to acknowledge this long history in our founding document would give every Australian the chance to connect with the truly inspiring story of our origins. And so it's time that we, the Australian people, choose the end to that silence together. Now, I see evidence everywhere of a strong and heartfelt desire to fix this. As young campaigners have been travelling the country on the journey of recognition, they've heard time and again from Australians who are shocked when they learn about the lack of recognition and want to be part of the movement to fix it. More than 176,000 of us have already signed up to do our bit in the months ahead. And today I ask each of you in this room, or if you're watching this broadcast, to sign up to the recognition campaign at recognise.org.au and throw yourself actively into making a case for recognition. Now, referendums are really notoriously hard to win in Australia, even with propositions as just as this. So if we want to see this great day come, none of us can sit back and hope that somebody else will make it happen. We, the people, need to make it happen. Over the next 9 months, a parliamentary committee led by Ken White and Nova Peris will begin the next important step of a set of conversations about the proposed model of recognition. All of us need to support them in the patient and methodical work that they have ahead of them as they seek to listen carefully, to harness everybody's goodwill in this task and to find a way through on the wording. 2 years ago, then opposition leader and now Prime Minister Tony Abbott observed that millions of Australians' hopes and dreams are resting on constitutional recognition of Indigenous peoples. Former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd said that the apology was about getting it right for the past, and constitutional recognition is about getting it right for tomorrow. As well as bipartisan political support, I've seen and heard for myself that mainstream Australia grasped the excitement, the possibility of this opportunity to bring us all closer together after many chapters of separation and exclusion. Now, we know this is a once-in-a-lifetime chance, so let's grasp it. A choice about whether we spend another generation living apart from each other or whether we come together at long last. That's the challenge. Only last Thursday we commemorated the anniversary of the apology to the stolen generations. With that apology for the forced removals of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, many torn away from their families, their country and their cultures, we saw speaking important truths can help people to heal. So I invite you to imagine speaking important truths, the recognition that our people were here. We will have similar healing powers, and those sort of questions, answering those questions, will have similar healing powers for all of us. It'll make a lot of people feel included after a long history of exclusion, and that will help us to move forward together in this land. So there are three common themes with the issues I've raised today. Firstly, whether I'm talking about closing the gaps, a healthier nation, international relations, the economy, reconciliation or recognition. Universities are key to whether they get better or worse. Our university communities have a big role to play. And the foundations of our future, as a lucky country, has to be built on respect. And both need investment and consistent attention to do properly. Secondly, participation is both a means and a goal, and strategies and engagement should be people-centred, empowering, not disempowering, and must encourage active engagement and partnership with all stakeholders, and particularly in relation to education, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and low socioeconomic groups. And thirdly, they are all things that governments can expect to hear from me about in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom Calma. Well, it is time now for our usual round of questions from the media, but I think I might ask the first one. You painted a picture, really, one I suppose many of us are aware of, but perhaps not quite as explicitly, of the slow pace of advancement of Indigenous Australians compared to many other countries. And I was just wondering, as you talked about the need for constitutional recognition, what would you say to those people who perhaps are ambivalent or uncaring about this issue? You've already said that it's notoriously difficult to get referenda passed in this country. What would you say to them about the impact, the negative impact that's well, I presume negative is perhaps I shouldn't make the judgment, but it seems pretty clear, impact that's going to have on Indigenous advancement into the future and Indigenous relations in this country?
Thank you. It's a very important question, and I guess there's a lot of evidence internationally that when people feel part of a system, when they feel included, when they feel respected, they will have advancement. We can see that through the Treaty of Waitangi, 1830 in New Zealand, where New Zealand citizens were recognised, where Maori people were recognised as citizens of New Zealand. In that case, we've seen some fairly significant advancements both within the higher education sector, but across all education sectors, and in employment and general well-being. That's not to say that everything's rosy when you get these agreements in place, but we do know that when they're not in place, we will have issues. There's still disadvantage in many of the communities, but we can't talk about issues like economic advancement, economic empowerment, unless we address what we call the determinants, and that's more broad-ranging. If we're looking at health, for example, you've got to not just see it as a health issue, but how does housing, overcrowded housing, how does lack of education, how does lack of employment contribute to poor health outcomes? We know, and there was just a report from the US released in the last few days about communities like, in this case, this research was about gay and lesbian communities and the impacts that isolation has on their communities, not only, and the discrimination that goes with it. It has an impact not only on mental health and higher levels of suicide, but also on cardiovascular health. And so we've got to look at all of these issues and make sure that and this will happen, it's not guaranteed, but it will happen over time if we get constitutional recognition and we address some of those elements of our constitution that do allow governments to put in place discriminatory practices.
A question now from Dan Harrison.
G'day, Dr Calma, Dan Harrison from The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. As you mentioned briefly in your speech, you were heavily involved in the creation of the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples. I wondered if you could reflect a bit on how you think that organisation's gone, and are you disappointed that the Commonwealth is not going to be providing any further funding to it?
Thanks, Dan. I think the first issue is that the Commonwealth has said that they're looking seriously at it. They haven't ruled it out to say that they're not funding, so I'd urge them to really think about this, and I think it's tied up with the May budget. But it is disappointing in a lot of ways that position has been put forward, because we've got to go back and look at and some of our international human rights documents, and particularly the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that was passed by the Human Rights Council back in 2007, and it talks about peoples, Indigenous peoples of the world, having a representative body. We know that when ATSIC was in place, governments invested quite significantly into ATSIC, but it wasn't a representative body. It was a construct of government, and hence it was able to be unconstructed when it was abolished by an Act of Parliament. It's disappointing at the moment because, and this goes across the board with a whole lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander policy. You know, a lot of success will happen when people feel included and they feel that their voice is being heard, that they're able to input into major policy reforms and development. That's what the Congress was starting to do, and it was a collective of people who were very, not representing individuals, but representing the communities that they come for, representing ideas that are common to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So having that undermined is really a difficult question. There were three things when I led the steering committee to establish the National Congress. Three things were there because I think at the time there was about 500 million going into ATSIC and at the Commission and down to the regional levels. And we said that we could do it ourselves. So we established a company limited by guarantee, and that's the National Congress, and went through a structure. What we asked government to do, and this was a collective voice, was to firstly support the establishment of the National Congress for the first 5 years, and to keep that money in so that we could get it established. Well, 3 years have passed, and I must say, and I'm not going to be political about this, but it was in the forward estimates, and money was pledged by the previous government to the Congress. That's been reneged on, and so that's created a problem. So one was the first 5 years to get funding to help it establish. The second component was to invest $10 million a year by the Commonwealth Government into an investment fund or a future fund, so that within 10 years we would look at raising equivalent funds so that we could be self-sustaining as a National Congress. And to be able to facilitate that process was the third element to it, and that was to get DGR status, or deductible gift recipient status, which is what is needed by any organisation who wants to be able to attract corporate and philanthropic funding so that they can offset it in tax. Well, that didn't happen until the 30th of June last year, so it came into effect from the 1st of July. So the government hasn't done their bit. What we argued was that at $10 million a year, which might seem like a big amount of money, but it's insignificant really when you look at the amount of resources taken off Aboriginal land across the nation. We're talking, you know, $20, $30 billion worth of revenue generated to the government off Aboriginal land, or previously owned by Aboriginal land, that was never succeeded, but it was appropriated by governments in the past. So it's very small compensation. And we also referred back to when the Native Title Act was put in place. One of the elements, not only was it about recognition of land, but it was part of that was a social justice package. And that social justice package was how do governments compensate those Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who didn't have their land, and so that was through an investment, and that has been, you know, very poorly managed. So you know, I think it's a bit premature for governments. Governments need to realise, and this is across the board, that if they can get people on side and to work together, we as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are apolitical. We're not interested in party politics. We're interested in getting the job done, addressing all those issues. Many of us see that we've got the solutions, but governments continually change direction. We have, you know, the political, you know, machinations of individual ministers who will change a direction, and each time that happens, it undermines the good faith of the communities. And so we want governments, and not only the federal government, but state and territory governments, to also understand that that's an issue, and that's what the Close the Gap campaign was about. We had that bipartisan, multi-party support to it, and we hope to enjoy that into the future.
Joanna Mather.
Joanna Mather, Australian Financial Review. There are two important reviews going on at the moment. One is of the curriculum, and another is of the uncapped system of university places. I wondered if you might share your views on those. Indigenous Australia is one of 3 cross-curriculum priorities at the moment in schools. Do you think that we should maintain that, I suppose?
Well, the first, yes, I think we should, and a real clear example, you know, there's no denying that there's probably other areas, and I know that there's been some discourse out there about representing businesses much more. You know, whoopie-doo. let's get on to looking at the real First Peoples and making sure that we can get the relationships understood. Because if we can get those relationships understood, and we will see a difference. And you know, I'd like to acknowledge the work that the New South Wales government's doing in their connected communities, where they are very much in these communities have taken a position to work with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and also with the general school population to run things like the Aboriginal language and a whole area of understanding curriculum and the local people through the reconciliation action plans. Another phenomenal, over 500 organisations around the nation have got reconciliation action plans, and the biggest message out of that is that people who work in those organisations, and we've seen it covers close to 1.6 million people, I think, come under reconciliation action plans as employees. When we've surveyed them, we find out that their attitudes towards Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are very significant compared to people in the general population. That they're enjoying, 70 to 80% support for Aboriginal issues. So what that's demonstrating is that when people are provided appropriate information in a non-biased way, they can empathise, they can become part of the solution. But when we try and deny it, then that becomes an issue. And so that's a challenge for governments. And to do that, there are other programs around the nation that do it. And I think the big message for governments was when a couple of years ago, the Northern Territory government, with the support of the feds, tried to overturn the bilingual education program, which is really heavily founded against understanding your first language and becoming competent in your first language before you go on to other learnings. The community just said, well, thank you, but you mightn't fund us, but we're still going to teach our culture and we're still going to be actively involved. And so fortunately that wasn't pursued. And it's interesting to see that the current discussion about autonomous schools and giving more responsibility to schools is to allow them to do some of that. So, some of these major initiatives, be it in the health sector or be it in the education sector, are actually modelled around what is good practice that exists in Aboriginal communities. And the Community Controlled Health Service is one of those very much, and we'll hear from Justin Mohammed about that in a couple of weeks' time.
I think the next question is from Brooke Boney.
Hello, Dr Calma. I'm Brooke Boney from NITV News. Last week we heard the Prime Minister set a new Close the Gap target on school attendance. Do you think that there should be a tertiary target? And just secondly, if I can be a little bit sneaky, what do you think about the co-payment scheme for Medicare? How do you think it'll affect Indigenous people?
Well, thanks, Brooke. Let's look at co-payment first. Look, it's a discussion that I guess will happen, and it's important that discussion and all these issues are raised in the public forum. But if governments want to ask those hard questions, they want to go into a consultation process, please listen to the outcomes of those consultation processes. Don't go through a whole charade of running consultation and then go and do what you want to do anyhow. You're wasting all of our time, and let's just get on with the job. So that's the first bit. What were the other two?
Close the gap.
The close the gap, yes. On target, yes. On school attendance was his target. We all aspire to do that, to get higher school attendance. But attendance is only one measure of success. Getting people in the door is not going to mean that you're going to learn. What you have to do, as I talked about in the speech, is looking at programs like the Australian Literacy and Numeracy Foundation program and other programs around the nation that are engaging with parents and getting them involved in a way that's supportive and with them, using them as a base to help guide the system, empowering them to get involved in the system, to train teachers. And there's some phenomenal sort of statistics on outcomes and the engagement of parents, which is very substantial, that we need to look at through programs like that. So a higher education target, I think, higher education is the end of a feeder group starting off at preschool. And so we've got targets for participation at preschool level. We need to now move it on to make sure that when kids get into preschool, they've already got a head start. And so they understand, because at that, I mentioned earlier the social determinants, which are really the issue. You can't study and you can't be good at education if you don't live in if you live in an overcrowded housing, if you've still got middle ear, otitis media issues, if you've still got trachoma or other issues affecting your health, if your family doesn't have the capacity to be able to support you in going through, because with health, for every year of education, you improve health outcomes, and that's what's critical. So you can't see any of these things in isolation. They've got to be seen holistically.
A question now from Jared Owens.
Dr Calma, Jared Owens from the Australian newspaper. You mentioned earlier some statistics regarding Indigenous people going through university, but in relation to actually Indigenous academics at university, do you see any merit in bringing more Indigenous people from other sectors of the economy if they've been successful into universities, and is there a risk that that might hollow out those other sectors?
Well, it does have an impact, and there's been a movement for decades now to try and get industry involved in the higher education sector, because it benefits both parties, people getting a realistic education for students when you've got industry sector inputs into them. But we also have other tensions, and that is that it depends on the qualifications of the industry person and their ability and who they can teach when they come into university. For example, you may be a top lawyer, but if you don't have a master's degree, you can't teach master's students. You've got to be virtually one qualification higher than the students you're teaching. So that's going to limit some people. So to have them come in as full-time academics is an issue. Have them come in as visiting academics is a much better relationship. But equally, it's about how do we get students out into the field to get that level of experience with industry. And we know that when they do that, they will progress through education quicker, and they will also be much more employable. We at University of Canberra are very fortunate in that our graduate employment is first class. We get a 5-star rating every year for that.
Mark Kenny.
Dr. Calma. Thank you very much for your address, and congratulations on your elevation. I was interested to hear about RMIT's experience working operating in a socialist state, and note they also expanded into Vietnam.
One in the same or different?
I thought that might take a while to register. Look, I wonder if I could just ask you about education policy, school education policy, in terms of it being important feeder to the university sector. The government seems to be moving toward a model, or favouring a model that's currently in vogue in Western Australia, of independent public schools, giving schools greater autonomy in terms of their structure, how they hire teachers, and how they structure their education. I wonder whether what views you have about that in terms of its overall role in education, whether you see it being of value and something that should be rolled out more across the country.
Yeah, I think the first response is that if you hang around long enough, you see policies of the past revisited. I was the chair of a school in Darwin, a primary school, in the late 80s, and we had devolution then of administrative responsibility coming down to the school to look after a whole lot of issues. That's been going on in the Territory and other states for some time. The latest version of it is going to be interesting, and I think the establishment of the new committee that was announced by Minister Pyne, is going to be a time to see how close the committee will actually consult, and how autonomous the committee can be to be able to actually change policy, or have we got a preconceived idea of what's going to happen, and so we go through a process which I happen to loosely refer to as a charade earlier, and which happens in too often in consultation processes, and we can just start to rattle them off one after another. That said, I think what I'd urge government to do is to look at some of the reports that are out there, that have been out there for some time. Look at what we're doing at University of Canberra in setting up a centre of quality in teaching and learning, and I mentioned the relationship with Chris Sara and what we're doing there, and his Stronger Smarter Institute. a CRC, a Cooperative Research Centre for Remote Economic Participation that I chair, which looks after 90% of Australia. We've got 67 partners, including nearly a dozen universities that are part of that. Our research is all about remote Australia, but when you look at a report that we've been working on for a couple of years, it's a 5-year study called the Red Dirt Curriculum, and that gives a lot of advice to government after many years of consultation. We know that the charter schools and the schools in the UK, there's very mixed outcomes in those, and there's a lot of dangers in them that we don't marginalise people even more, particularly those socioeconomic people, and also to make sure that the schools, and when we start to look at, that purchasing model and the local autonomy has some merits if you're in an urban environment. When you're in a remoter environment or a rural environment where the services you can't purchase them more readily, and then that has difficulty. So, the clear message in all of this, and we say it all the time, is that there's no one size fits all, there's no one silver bullet. Let's look at how we can best, apply local practices.
And David Spears.
David Spears from Sky News. As a graduate of your university, can I also congratulate you on your appointment? I want to ask you about what you've said on philanthropy and tease that out a little. You've said that it's not strictly true we don't have a culture of philanthropy in Australia, but what's working and what's not? And is there a role for the smaller individual donations for the mere mortals who don't have the tens or $50 million that we've heard about recently? What can be done to promote more of that?
Look, and that's really a key issue, because there are going to be some philanthropists who have the means to do it. There's some corporates who have the means, and we just saw one of the big mining companies donate $20 million into early childhood education, somebody from the West, where all the big money is. But, and that's really welcomed in looking at that program. But there is a role for each of us, and I say that about each of us because, you don't have to donate a lot. Workplace giving programs are really important, where just a couple of dollars a week out of the pay packet can go towards, a cause. We run, my family personally contributes to refugee scholarships and Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander scholarships at UC and other institutions, and they're only small, but they're enough to help somebody to buy books, to be able to just get them over any of the humps that they might feel. So you don't have to be rich, you don't have to have big money to go in any one hit, but to be able to put it in small ways. And workplace giving is really a good way to go. We also see the issue of crowdfunding that's now starting to gain a bit of popularity. And I think universities will start to use that a bit more in research or in other philanthropic sort of endeavours to try and get that support. So we can all do it. It's just a matter of having that mindset to want to be able to do something for somebody else, because it all comes around, and we'll never know when our children are at university, our grandchildren, and we want them to get the best education and the best opportunities in the future. So please think about giving, even if it's a small amount.
We're getting close to time, but I would like to take 3 more questions. The next from Tony Melville.
Tony Melville, Director of the National Press Club. It's a bit of a personal question. There's at least 2 and maybe more speakers at the National Press Club who went to the same school as you, and indeed Andrew Liveris, the global CEO of Dow, who was a speaker here, and you were in the same class at the same little school in Darwin, perhaps some others. Is there something about that education? What did they do?
Well, the first important thing is it was public education. We went through Darwin High School. But it was, Darwin is that sort of very, very, we used to call it cosmopolitan sort of place, because we had so many different population groups, including a high percentage of Aboriginal people going to school. Look, it was that whole thing. For me, it's about relationships, it's about respect, it's about being non-discriminatory. Not saying that there wasn't discrimination, racial discrimination, there was, and we've all experienced it. But when presented with opportunities, I find, and have seen it across the nation over many years, where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people will thrive if we're given the opportunity, given the supportive environment, if we're allowed to be able to take on whatever endeavour it's going to be, to be able to do it in a way that we're comfortable with. And that's what we see through the RAP plans, the mentoring programs, the population education programs like we've got at the Department of Health, led by Jane Holton. In looking at tobacco control, it's a population health approach. It's about engaging with people, empowering people to take control of their lives. And that's the sort of philosophy we learnt at school. And Andrew's done okay.
Virginia Hausiger.
Virginia Hausiger from ABC News here in Canberra, and also a great honour to be an adjunct professor at the University of Canberra. And I too congratulate you on your appointment. There's been much talk about regional universities recently and the challenge to remain sustainable and indeed, of course, economically viable. And of course, that's a challenge for all universities. As a local Canberran, I must say it's been exciting to see the University of Canberra grow and develop over the last decade or so, particularly the last few years, and introduce a number of very innovative programs, some of which you've touched on today. As the new Chancellor, I'd like to ask you, what do you see as being the single point of difference for the University of Canberra as it faces those challenges of the future? What will set it aside and make it the strong university that we all believe it will be? And if that sounds like an offer for a shameless plug, feel free.
Thank you. No, I appreciate that. Look, and this is maybe common to a lot, but it's about having a very innovative Vice-Chancellor and senior administration within the university. It's about having a good governance committee, and the council that I work with are super. They're top, very innovative, very entrepreneurial, but always with a really strong foundation on equality and social justice and understanding those, but also understanding the economics of where we have to go. We've got a tremendous student body, and we unlike some universities, are moving away from having students and staff representatives on their council. We encourage that, and we do have, which is important because we want to have that close linkage with people, but being able to respond to needs when they are. We're in a bit of a fortunate position that we've got the Australian Institute of Sport here. We've also a small place. We've got the tremendous relationships with the Brumbies, and you'll see some more maybe come up in the near future. But we're responding to community needs, and not just at the elite level, but the whole thing through our university. And we have, and we've enjoyed increasing enrolments from international students over all those years. When they dropped down in other institutions, ours went up. I think with regional universities, small universities, young universities like ours, it takes some time to build up a head of steam. It's happening with us. I think the challenges are going to be able to address, and we see a significant, new cohort of potential cohort of people coming in with all the manufacturing industry closing down around the country. People need to be retrained, and so that's going to be, for some of our regional universities, a very important place to be. We'll do it, and I think the other big one is the way we're going and developing relationships with the vet sector or the TAFE sector, and with Holmes Glen College in Melbourne and some of the other TAFE institutions, vet institutions around the nation, where we're able to offer people a good transition from early entry into post-schooling, be it a certificate or a diploma, right through to a degree, to a high degree, if they want to do it. So, yeah, there's a lot, and I believe that we're in a good place.
Well, as a graduate of your institution as well, let me ask the...
They're everywhere.
Let me ask the final question today. I was recently involved in a project which I think is being launched tomorrow and will effectively close, as it does, next month, I think it is, to mark the end of the year, the centenary year here in Canberra, a time capsule project which is to be open 100 years from that day next month. And I got to thinking about what would Australia look like in 100 years, what would my profession look like? But I'm just wondering, what's your vision of Indigenous Australia 100 years from now? And how important is it, do you think, that there are leaders like you in highly visual positions, Indigenous leadership positions, as an encouragement to your people?
Thank you, and a good question. I'll just address the time capsule question. I was too slow to be able to respond to the invitation to
I almost
contribute
was
to
too,
that.
I've got to say.
But I think the challenge is going to be whether, with all the advancements in technology, whether they'll be able to read anything that we put in the time capsule in 100 years' time. But that said, I think it's a great legacy for the centenary of Canberra. We will be, in 100 years, I hope within 20 years, well and truly entrenched in the Constitution, that people will see and understand that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have and enjoy the longest continuing culture in the world, we're here, and we will still be here into the future. Our numbers are growing very rapidly. Our entry into the education sector, albeit slow, is starting to happen, and we will get more people through. It's got to be accelerated. We need support to be able to do that, because the big issue is what has been denied up until very recently, and that's the opportunity and the access of funding. And whilst we've had various ministers tout about how much has been spent, let's look at the real facts. How much actually hits the ground and gets spent with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and how much is taken off in that layer of administration to administer these programs. How many of the programs have been developed in close partnership and consultation and with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? They're the real challenges, but we'll be there. We'll still be here in 20, 50, 100 years' time. People like Chris Burke, Jill Milroy and so forth. Kelvin Kong, our first Indigenous surgeon. We're very proud of all of these firsts and everybody that follows. And we as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, hopefully we can lead that charge and all work together.
Tom Calma, you have a very important event coming up in a few minutes, so let's finish on that note.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments today, Dr Calma. Thank you very much for your contribution, and congratulations, of course, on your appointment as Chancellor of the University of Canberra. This is not the first time that you've addressed the National Press Club, but it's a particularly special and important occasion this time round, and I expect that we may well be hearing from you again at some point in the future. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Dave. I think it's the fifth time.